Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Gardening on the Gulf Coast, a series of lectures that are presented online by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and Aggie Horticulture. We're very proud to be bringing these programs to you. Um, Up today, July the 8th, is Young Tree Care with Boone Holladay. He's an AgriLife Extension Horticulture agent in Fort Bend County. We have several other programs that we'll be hosting throughout the month of July. Next week, same time, same day, July the 15th at 10 a.m., Cacti and Succulent Varieties with Kevin Gibbs of Nueces County. July the 22nd, Fabulous Figs for the Gulf Coast by myself, Stephen Brugerhoff, Extension Horticulture Agent in Brazoria County. And then July the 29th, Earthkind Pest, Disease, and Weed Control with Skip Richter, Horticulture Agent in Brazos County. We thank you all for joining us this morning. We will let you know that we are recording the program for posterity and for later viewing. We do ask a few courtesy items for the presenter. If you do have, we ask that you turn off your microphone, mute your microphone, as well as dim your video, turn off your camera. That way we can save bandwidth for the presenter. Presentation may take close to an hour, maybe a little bit longer. We thank you for joining us today for this program. There will be several videos that will be in the presentation. We're going to be asking you to continue to interact with us. Myself, Stephen Brugerhoff, horticulturist with Brazoria County AgriLife Extension, as well as Skip Richter with Brazos County AgriLife Extension, horticulturist, will be providing answers to you. If you want to post a question, please use the cursor over, scroll it over your screen. A box will show up, will pass up, and you'll see a little word balloon as far as one of the items, the icons. Use. Go ahead and click onto that. It opens up a meeting chat function or box that you can then post a question. Both Skip and I, as well as other fellow horticulturists that may be joining us, will be able to answer those questions for you. At the end of each video presentation, I will interact with Mr. Holladay and post some of those questions to him that are being asked in the chat function. We thank you so much for joining us this morning. Again, this is brought to you by the Southeast region of Aggie Horticulture, horticulturists up and down the coast, bringing outstanding programs to you for best practices in horticulture. Thank you very much. Boone, take it away.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I appreciate the invite to be here this morning to talk about trees. Depending on where you're at along the region, for most of us, trees are an important part of the landscape. And one that, as gardeners, we tend to get caught up in fruits and vegetables and annuals and perennials in the landscape, turf grass issues, etc. And trees is one that tends to kind of get left out sometimes, but I would argue is probably one of the most important items within our home landscapes for multiple reasons. And so, why are trees important? They do lots of good things for our home. They potentially keep our house cool during the summer months, saving us on electric bills. They provide necessary habitat for wildlife. They provide us personally comfort for being underneath some shade in these dog days of summer, particularly. The general aesthetics of just having the structural value in the landscape of trees increase the value of your property, etc. The list goes on. And so, we need to value these trees. And one thing as a horticulturist is to try to help people understand that these are biological entities and that trees don't last forever. And so even if we have a couple trees in the landscape, we may have some that are ending their natural lifespan, and start making some decisions for the future of planting the next generation of tree canopy in the home landscape. So I'm going to cover all these in these little video clips that I recorded, so I don't have to talk quite as much today. and you don't have to see me sitting here in the office. So this is a new format for me as far as the presentation goes. So hopefully it works well. Again, Stephen, Skip, and others will be in the background responding to questions in the chat box. If Stephen has something that's pertinent to the conversation for me to expand on, we'll do that in between the video segments. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. If you'll be patient, I know a lot of times we have pressing questions, but here, if you look through my outline on the left-hand side, you'll see that I'm going to basically cover everything from A to Z on trees within these video segments. So, and just looking at this real quick, to scan through the items here on my outline, just so you know kind of what order I'm going to be going through these. And start off with location. I'm going to look at soil and drainage, talk about seasonality, what to look for in a tree, site preparation, planting practices, how to plant a tree, mulching, staking, and then a segment on multiple items of post-planting maintenance of trees, including watering, fertilization, and integrated pest management techniques. So here we go. Let's see if I can get this rolling. I'm going to talk about spacing. When we're just designing the landscape and trying to figure out a place to put a tree, we have to consider the size of the tree. And I know we're tempted as gardeners and homeowners to plant multiple trees in a small area, especially if you have a small suburban lot, or maybe more tree species that you'd like to have that you really have room for. And so it's really good to do your homework and make sure that we know how big those trees are going to get at maturity, and then we put them in the landscape in an area where they can thrive. What I have right here behind you is a young longleaf pine. And this one we planted about four and a half years ago. And we planted multiple of these throughout the yard here to eventually provide a nice shade and a good open landscape. But we gave these trees plenty of room. What we know about this species here is that it's going to max out at about 120 feet tall and maybe a 60-foot wide canopy. So it has to have space to spread out. So we did that when we looked at this. Back here in the back, we have an existing post oak. Over here, we have a bodark tree. And then back behind me over here is a loquat leaf oak. And we put this in a spot right in between all these where there's plenty of room. These other trees can continually grow. These trees aren't finished growing. They're going to continually come out this direction. But we still allow enough space here for this tree to have its own area. Plenty of root zone space and plenty of visible sunlight for the canopy to go up. And as we space these around the yard, you can see we put another one right over here. Same thing with it. We triangulated these other trees, the loquat leaf oak, there's a pecan and a pear back over there, and then this post oak. Put the tree right in between these, but as those other trees continually grow, this tree will still have enough space to grow up. Same thing over here. If we pan off in this direction, we put this longleaf pine. It's a little close to this hackberry tree. Eventually the hackberry will go away. We know that. That's a short-lived tree. And then this tree will have plenty of room to grow. We left plenty of space between the elm, the post oak, and this post oak, so that as it grows up into maturity, it's going to have its own space. It's never going to compete with other trees and go through the stress that's associated with tree competition. So just to show you that, proper design is going to make for a landscape that's going to look beautiful more and more year after year. Okay. Stephen, did we have any questions on this?
No questions, Boone. Not just yet.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. and maybe a reminder for other folks to turn their cameras off as well, so that we've got enough bandwidth for these videos to stay. Okay. Okay. One thing that's important to think about is your soil and drainage. A lot of Fort Bend County, where we're at here, we have a lot of heavy clay soils, flat with poor drainage. And these can be issues when we're looking at planting trees, where we'd have some stagnant areas in the soil and potentially some root rot issues. So something I can show you real quick here is just what we call a soil percolation test, something to do when you're trying to identify the right spot in the landscape and make planting decisions. Because we're gonna just dig a little hole out. I've got my little shovel here. I'm gonna dig this grass out of the top first. Take our fancy post hole diggers here, and we're gonna go down. For the sake of time, I may not go all the way. I'd like to go about 18 inches deep, because that's kind of the root zone of what we expect this young tree is going to grow down into. So we need to see if that soil is going to drain. Now, I don't like to brag much, but I would brag on our soil here. This is not typical of most of Fort Bend County. Can you zoom down here a little bit? This is first thing we want to do is just dig a little bit of the soil and put it in your hand and feel of it. This right here is what we call sandy loam soil. It breaks apart, but if I feel it in my hand, there's some moisture in there. And so with this type of soil texture, we know that this is going to drain pretty well. It's not going to be a huge problem for us. If you dig this out and this is that dark black Victoria clay, grayish clay, if it's hard when it's dry, or if you squeeze it and it forms into a clay shape, that means you know we probably have some drainage issues. Further than that, what we would do about this time of day is right before sunset, I'm gonna dig that hole, and I'm just gonna fill this up with water. 18 inches deep, 24 inches deep if you're going with a larger tree. I'm just gonna fill that up all the way to the top. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that like that, and I'm gonna come out here tomorrow morning. I'm gonna look at this hole. And I would expect that most of this water overnight should drain out. This hole should be, and this soil should be empty. If you come back out here tomorrow and this looks a lot like that, or if this is only drained down about halfway, then you know we have some issues there. And you've got two things that you can do. One is to choose another location. If you've got a different spot in the landscape that drains well, that's maybe raised up a little higher, that might be the better spot. The second thing that we would do is raise that tree up some. Okay, that crown, that buttress little crown of the tree, you want to build some soil up, build up about a foot, so that as it's a young tree, it has the chance for those young roots to grow down and have oxygen in the root system prior to it finally settling in. Once the tree gets established, it's going to be good, but it's this transplanting process, this short time frame while the tree is getting established, it can be difficult for young trees. Okay. Stephen, do we have any questions yet so far?
No, sir. We got a lot of shy folks out there, so no questions yet.
Fantastic. How was the video showing up on the screen?
Well, if some participants can also enter into the chat box how the video looks to you. On my end, it's just slightly glitchy, but the vocals are coming in just fine.
Okay, fantastic. Well, again, all the participants, if you've got particular questions in between the video segments, that'd be entertaining. any of those questions through Stephen. So just put those in the chat box and keep those coming. If there's not any right now, I'll go ahead and move forward to the next one.
Oh, Boone, if you could please repeat, how far did you say to dig down in the hole?
Yes, indeed. For small trees, 1 gallon to 5 gallon trees, I would go down about 18 inches because that is going to represent the rooting zone of that tree as it's getting established. If you're getting a large tree, a 15, 30, 45 gallon tree in a large container, I would go down 2 feet with that hole.
Excellent. One more question, then we'll move on to the next one. If
Sure.
you have the raising planting level up if you have to raise the planting level up due to poor drainage, do you use native soil or do you add an amendment, additional soil?
Yep, just use native soil. So digging around. I think the next video is going to show developing a tree ring. Is just bring some of that as you move out in that planting ring. Is bring some of that native soil in, or also if you've got another location on site with a similar profile soil, it's much better to go with the native soil because of the soil texture. And I'll get into that a little bit, but basically we want that tree to understand what the confines it's going to have on soil as it matures and sends those roots out into the profile versus having fancy soil right there close up to the tree. What we would end up having is some of those roots actually migrating upwards towards the surface in that planting area that's raised instead of moving out laterally out into the landscape, and we don't want that to happen. I'm going to talk just briefly here about site preparation. This is something that's very important and something that I think a lot of people don't do correctly, and you end up having issues down the road with trees not establishing well, vegetation encroaching onto the young trees that either is going to compete for nutrients and water for the young establishing plant. It's going to put it into a little bit of stress, or it may encourage you to get a little bit too close with the string trimmer as you're going around the tree in the landscape if you've got grass growing up the sides of it. So what I like to do is after I've laid out my landscape plan, I've marked the tree where I want it. I want to go in here and I want to define this spot. So I'll mark it with a marker flag, and I like to go out. I know it may sound crazy, but even for a small tree, I like to go 5 or 6 feet in a diameter around where this tree is going to be and remove all the existing vegetation. So real quick, I'm just going to go here for this one here. I got 2 feet and 3 feet. Let's go 2.5 feet with that mark. And I'm just going to kind of eyeball this as I go around, about the same amount from that flag and a couple little spots. Okay, and once I've got my circle there, I can go in, I'm going to mark it real nice. Just like that. Maybe go ahead and put my little dot in there just for fun. Okay, now within this spot right here, I want all the vegetation out of this area because when I plant that tree in here, I don't want it to have to compete with anything. I want it to have its own special little spot where it's going to get established and avoid going into plant stress. If I can avoid that plant stress or transplant shock process, tree is going to respond much quicker, put on new foliage, get some roots put into the ground. So the next part of this is your personal decision. What I would use in here up to this spray painted line is I would use a broad spectrum herbicide that's labeled for grass and some broadleaf weeds that are in here. And then within a week or two, this would clear out this area of vegetation, and that would leave me a spot that's nice and ready that I could plant in that spot within 2 or 3 weeks after spraying it with herbicide. If you have reservations against herbicide, that's perfectly fine. You just need to know that you got to find an alternative way to get this vegetation out of here. And the most obvious, I think, is manual labor. You're going to need to take a hoe and a shovel and some hard garden rakes and dig all this out, sift out all the grass, and get everything good, nice and clear out of here so that we don't have any resprout. You've got some weeds in here. There's some little dollar weed. Most of this is Bahia grass, and there's a little bit of Bermuda over there that you got to get down low, and you got to get all that out of there. And once it's gone, then we're going to cover that area with a good layer of mulch to keep those weeds from coming back. By keeping this area clean here, I mean, it's keeping the tree healthy. It's keeping it from competing with existing vegetation. But it's also keeping you away from that plant. When you're mowing out here, you don't want to have to mow right up onto the tree. And when you're using your string trimmer around the edges, that you're not tempted to come up here and get close to this young tree and remove some of its fragile young bark. Any questions, Stephen?
One question is related to building the ring around, building up the soil mound, and it's regarding how does one build up a mound using native soil if the native soil is gumbo, not draining? So I think it's a question more related to using native soil, which is what we're recommending.
Yeah, and we've one of our master gardeners here in Fort Bend has developed a good presentation on this, and I really liked her idea. If you've got a large feed bucket, at least something 15 gallons or larger, it's just digging up that clay soil, and if you wet it down a little bit with a water hose with a spray nozzle, then come back in the next morning with the shovel and just break it apart. That should be enough to go ahead and break that clay up enough that you can start to shape it when you're trying to redo that hole.
Good morning, Mr. Villa. This is Alex Moreno with the Langford College Savings Retirement.
All right. That was the only major question.
Okay. And we're listening to somebody's voicemail there as well, so we might want to get
I
them.
cut it off. I'm sorry.
Yes, and please, if you'll mute your microphone too, please. I will apologize. The slide here says seasonality. This will be a different slide, so we'll just adjust that as needed. I'm going to talk just a little bit about tree selection. I've got a couple small trees right here to use as some examples. I just want to cover the bases on this, and that most people, when you look for a tree, you want to go with a 15, 20, 30-gallon tree. And those larger specimens in the containers have a hard time transplanting into the landscape. They go through a little period of stress, and if you're not managing that tree correctly, you can have some issues down the line. And repeatedly, through research and studies, we found that if you plant a 5-gallon, a good, healthy, young, vigorous tree right next to a 5-year-old 15, 20-gallon specimen, plant them in the ground, treat them the same, and within 5 years, this little young tree is going to be the same size or larger than the 15-gallon or the larger specimen. The reason for that is that this tree's got more vigor, it's younger, it's healthier, and so it's going to root in, it's going to get established in the ground much faster than a tree that's been in a container in a contained environment for a couple of years, that's been going through stress associated with not having enough root system in place. So I might try to talk you in to growing with a younger tree. The other upside to it is that you'll end up spending considerably less money with the original investment of the tree. When you go to the nurseries, it's hard to find sometimes the younger trees, but you can, if you go in early in the year and pre-order trees or talk to the nurseryman about what you want, a lot of times they'll special order some trees for you. What I have right here is a little red maple tree that I wanted to show you. And this right here is a beautiful little species. And I'll go through it. I'm looking at this little trunk. It's a good, healthy trunk, real nice and smooth. It shows a lot of good growth in between these internodes. I got good foliage at the top, a couple branches, good, healthy, young leaves. And also, if I turn this over and I ease this out of here, we've got a good fibrous root system down here towards the bottom, around the sides, and most importantly, I don't see a whole lot of circling roots in here inside the container that maybe means that it's been in this pot too long, and that may end up strangling this little tree once you put it in the ground. And so a couple other examples here. We've got a little pecan tree. If you're really on a tight budget and you want a tree in a couple years, this one here is going to set you back probably $7 or $8, and then it will eventually grow up into a nice landscape tree. So sometimes you can find those. But the flip side to that is I got a larger tree here. It's got a thicker trunk, but if I pull this out of the container, a couple things I'm noticing real quick. There's really not much soil, and this could happen to a plant that's been in the nursery too long. And if I look down here at the bottom, I see some circling roots in here, some darker colored roots that aren't healthy. And then if I look up here towards the top, I see some tip burn, some leaf burn on this that suggests that it's been in some heat stress. So this is a tree right here that I would probably avoid. And then right in the middle here of those two, we've got a little 2 or 3 gallon pecan. It's got a good, nice straight trunk, good foliage on it, and we got a good amount of soil in here. And if I pull that out, I see I got some fibrous roots on here. There's no circling in here. So this may be a tree that I'd want to go ahead and put in the landscape. Talking you into a younger tree, I've had more success with young trees than I have, and then dealing with homeowners repeatedly, people having issues with the larger trees. This would be my recommendation of something to start with. Any questions, Stephen?
Yes, there was a question about applying a root stimulator to newly planted trees.
Mm-hmm. That wouldn't hurt. Fertilizers, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I would avoid, any quick release, salt-based or nitrogen fertilizers at planting, because those are going to have a negative impact potentially on the developing root hairs as the tree is developing and getting established. But using some type of a rooting hormone in there is probably not a bad idea. What you have to be careful about is that sometimes at the nurseries you'll see something called a starter solution, and you may assume that this is a rooting hormone. But a lot of times, basically all those are is a liquid fertilizer, and so you may end up having some negative impacts on the tree. I don't think it's necessary. I don't personally use rooting hormones when I'm planting trees. If I follow all the other steps correctly and just do everything I can to give that tree some TLC, if I start with a healthy tree and I control the environmental conditions appropriately, it's gonna take off and go. But I wouldn't discourage you from using rooting hormones.
Excuse me, on circling roots or girdling roots or whatever, how do you plant something like that if you try to plant it?
Yes, good question. It depends on how much we're talking about. If there's maybe one root down in the bottom of the container that's starting to swirl around, just cut that off with your pruners prior to planting. And maybe break that root ball apart a little bit with a shovel or with a good pair of pruners, and then just remove those circling roots. If you pull that out of the container in the nursery, and it's just a bunch of spiral action going on in there, several large established roots that are twining around, again, I would put that back in the container and I would walk away. It's just not going to be the right tree for you. Good question. But if we can, please direct those questions to Stephen in the chat box, and I'll make sure that I get to those in between the breaks. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me now, Stephen?
Yes, sir. Hear you just
Okay.
fine.
Right. I'll have to apologize. I'm missing one video here, and this is on tree selection at the nursery and seasonality. And so before I get into this slide here on planting, let me just do a little dialogue into that piece. Obviously, the middle of July is not the time that we're going to be planting trees in Southeast Texas. This is the time, though, for us to start making decisions on where we're going to put the trees in the landscape and where we're going to get those trees, what species we're going to settle on, what's going to be the right size tree for us, and most importantly, where are we going to get the tree from? And so most of you know your independent retail plant nurseries in your communities. I would go there now and talk to your nurseryman about trees. If you've settled in on 4 or 5 species, maybe is to share that with them. What most nurseries do is, by mid-spring, they're trying to clear out inventory of trees because they're just having to hold those trees there in the nursery through the summertime for fall sales and planting. So you may not find the trees there in the nursery that you want right now. Some nurseries, the one that I went to was Enchanted Gardens here in Richmond, is they do have a nice tree nursery there on site, and they take good care of those trees. And so a couple things that you want to look for if you see trees in the nursery this time of year is you want to look to see that those trees are well maintained. If they're on drip irrigation, if you see some fertilizer that's been applied to the surface of those containers, you want to look to see if those containers are filled with potting medium. Not like the one I showed in the last video where it's only about half full. You want that container filled up, and that's maximizing the root space in there. You want to look at the trunk of the tree, make sure that there's no scarring or damage. If it's tall, that it's been tied up to a trellis string or it's staked up appropriately. If there's trees in the nursery that have fallen over as you're walking through there, those are maybe signs of poor maintenance of those trees. So look through there, make sure that those trees are well maintained, and that's going to help you decide that if you want to go ahead and flag one of those trees sooner than later, that you can go ahead and either purchase or flag those trees for a fall planting. We don't really want to start putting trees in the ground. I mean, if we have the choice, sometimes in a commercial planting, they have to, just through necessity of getting the job site complete, they have to make bad decisions when it comes to timing of tree planting. But for you as a homeowner, you don't have that confine. So I would honestly recommend starting probably December 1st is when we start getting the more consistently cooler weather, where it's the environmental hazards are starting to diminish and our trees can get in the ground safely. And then somewhere probably through March 1st would be the last that I would be recommended to plant a tree. So if those species aren't in the nursery when you go searching, is to talk to your nurseryman, your local independent nursery owners or managers, and tell them what trees you want, and they'll kind of share what their availability may look like in the fall, the size of those trees, and so you can start making some decisions to get those trees at the right time and start the process of getting them planted at the right time of year. So that takes us into this is proper planting, and this is middle of July, so I want to talk through this diagram here instead of me actually going out and losing 5 pounds of sweat to show you this live. But this is basically what we're trying to accomplish here when we're digging our hole. We want to dig out a pretty good ways. This is two or three times the diameter of the root mass in the container away from that. We don't really want to go much deeper here. It's probably a good idea to dig down a little bit deeper and then replace some of the loose soil back underneath where the tree is going, and then tamper that down just a little bit, and so that we have maybe broken that up underneath the root ball to encourage some root infiltration down into the root zone. And then as we're moving this out of the hole, again, using a tarp out here or some cardboard or a large container to store that soil and break it up. If you've got a heavy soil, try to break those clods up as much as you can. And then we'll insert the tree centered into this hole, making sure that this crown here, okay, where we see these little buttressing roots here, is that it's at the right height to where we want it. If you've got good drainage in this soil here, you can get away with putting this crown right at soil level, as this diagram is suggesting. If we're in a really heavy soil and we did our percolation test and this is not draining like we hope it would, this is where we take this spot here where we start to see this arching, and we're going to raise that up either 2, 4, 6 inches or higher up, depending on how bad that drainage is. If we woke up in the morning and there's just a little bit of puddling in the bottom of the hole that you made in the percolation test, you might raise it up just a little bit, okay? But if you went out there in the morning with your cup of coffee and you were confused because the hole was still almost full, let's bring that tree way up and let's mound the soil down as we planted this tree. Eventually, those tree roots are going to grow laterally down underneath the turf into this rooting zone, but at least this helps us get up above that so we don't end up drowning that tree. In backfilling the soil in here, it's a good idea to do this in stages, is to start at the bottom, maybe fill the hole about halfway up, break that up real good with your shovel, and then add some water to that. Saturate that area with water till it's nice and moist, and then backfill a little bit more in here. Break that up with your shovel, add some water to that to saturate it. Continue that maybe 2 or 3 times until the hole is filled up completely. And what that's helping to do is settle that soil down so that we don't have huge voids of soil in very large air pockets that may dry out the root system. Now, the flip side to that, to be careful, is that I'm not suggesting that we're taking the end of the shovel and compacting the soil as we're filling the hole in. We still want this loose. We don't want huge pockets of air in there, but we do want it to be able to breathe. So we're not compacting it. We're just trying to let that soil settle in and fill those large voids, especially if you have a clayey soil that's real blocky. When you fill it back in there, there's going to be large voids in between those particles that we're going to want to try to settle in as much as we can. And then we come here and we're going to level this off to the surface, making sure that we're not covering the crown here with soil. You can, or if you choose to, develop this small berm of a soil ring out at the edge of this hole. And really the only reason that we would do that is that as we're watering this tree during establishment, is just allowing us a little zone in here where we can saturate this to allow that water to go down instead of flushing out laterally into the landscape. So that's really optional for you at this point. And then once we've got the soil the way we want it, we're going to cover this whole area with a good layer of wood mulch. Any questions, Stephen, in the chat box?
No, sir, related to that particular slide.
Yes. Okay. On tree selection, was there anything there?
I'll have to revisit that with you, sir. There was a question on pruning, but currently if you will be talking about that, I'll ask for patience from the participant. Other than that, I directed them to an Earthkind landscaping website on pruning.
Good. Okay. All right, then we'll go ahead and move on. Thanks, Stephen. Let's talk about mulch for a minute. This is another one of the pines that we planted a couple years ago. And again, you see this area. Let's talk about mulch for a minute. This is another one of our pines that we planted a couple years ago. And again, you see this area around the tree. This one, I've kind of worked it up to about 7 feet, almost 8 feet of vegetation-free zone. And that way, when we're mowing around here, we're not getting anywhere close to the base of this tree. And we use a large zero-turn mower, and so there is some weight to that tractor that will compact the root system close up to this tree. So we want to stay away. So we keep this area clean, and we keep a good layer of mulch on here about twice a year. I like to add just a little bit of new mulch onto the surface here. We are getting some pine needles now that are naturally falling and adding to this mulch. This keeps a good depth on the surface here that is discouraging weeds, that is moderating the soil temperature, that is holding in soil moisture at between rainfalls, and just aesthetically looks nice, and it keeps me from doing any damage to the base of this tree. You look at this kind of from an angle, you see how raised up this is. That's not all mulch. I did raise this up a little bit, the soil contour, to get the tree up a little bit. Our soils here have pretty good drainage on their own, but still we do have heavy bouts of rain occasionally. And so I wanted to plant this tree up a little bit. But as you can see here from the base, besides for the fire ants, you start to see the crowning of the tree right here. Okay, so the natural crown of the tree is right there. And so I haven't buried that buttressing crown of the tree. I've just covered it up with just a little bit of mulch on there, just to keep the vegetation from growing up at the base of that. It's a very important process for us here for these trees to settle in. Again, we've done research as far as mulch on trees, and just a good thick layer of mulch next to a tree that hasn't been mulched will grow twice as fast or more. So if you're trying to get a young tree established quickly, this is the way to go, because the tree is not going to be stressed. It's going to be vigorous and growing, and you'll end up getting a big, healthy tree much faster. All right, Stephen, any questions?
Yes, one question, pretty good question. What kind of mulch would you suggest to use? And one part of that question is fresh freshly shredded woody material.
Yeah, very good. I tend to tell people a mulch is a mulch is a mulch. A lot of it, when you go to the nursery centers, there's this, 5,000 pallets of options there. A lot of it just has to do with personal preference, as far as the texture, color, etc. But for me, some of the just personal valuable reasons for using just native hardwood mulch, or in the case here, we like to use native cedar mulch. These are recycled products that are used from landscape businesses and so forth. That's being recycled within the region, and then put back out into landscapes. So for that reason alone, I would suggest using a native type mulches, either native hardwood or native cedar mulches. Some of the mulches that you'll find, um, cypress or eucalyptus, etc. They've got a pretty big carbon footprint of moving those materials from one place to the other. So I would suggest just using the native mulches. When you get into the old pine bark nuggets type stuff, you have to be careful with those, because during heavy rains, those do want to migrate around quite a bit. And I've had good luck with either just the hardwood mulch or this cedar mulch as interlocking pretty nicely on the surface, so that it stands up pretty well to avoiding erosion. Good question.
Okay, I'm here today at an undisclosed location in Fort Bend County, but unfortunately way too common. Okay, I'm here today at an undisclosed location in Fort Bend County, but unfortunately way too common of using these trees as examples of potential staking issues on trees. When you're planting your young tree, more than likely the tree doesn't need to be staked. If it's young, if it's got a good root system, if it's stable and anchored into the container the way the roots are, or if it has a good, short, straight trunk with not too much top weight on it, if you plant it in the ground and it stays up on its own, and it's not so top heavy that the whole tree is going to just fall over out of the hole with high winds, I'd recommend not to stake the tree, because that movement of those young trees actually builds strength in that young trunk and helps it develop into a stronger tree as it matures. But if you end up having a tree that does need some staking, you need to know that this is a very short-term process, 1 year maximum, just to allow that tree to get rooted into the ground and develop a little bit of trunk strength so it can stand up on its own. As soon as that's happened, we need to remove those stakes. These trees have been here for probably 15 years, and unfortunately that never happened. It's way too common that I can find examples of this in commercial plantings across the county. But what we have here, we started it pretty much right. Okay, we've got some T-posts. They use 2. I would recommend 3 triangulated out away from the tree. They use a twisted wire strap. You can either use wire or you can use a taunt rope. And then right here, we used a couple pieces of old water hose. Okay, we run that down the lines, and we put that on the opposite side of the tree where the pressure is as you're pulling that away. And by putting this water hose on here, or you can buy a similar commercial item, is this stops the tree from getting girdled by the movement of the tree and the wind. Is this moving around? If we just have this wire or rope wrapped around the tree, that movement is going to rub that bark raw and eventually cause some girdling problems. This diminishes that a little bit, so it's a good idea to have. Other thing to think about is that when we're putting this on, don't pull these these stakes real tight and don't tighten the wires down real tight. We want to have a little bit of pressure, but we want to allow the tree to move as well. That movement is going to allow the young trunk to develop some strength. But also here, we don't want to have it so loose that it's really not doing anything for the tree. So it's very important, staking early on if you need it. If you don't do it. But also remember, put it on your calendar of when you planted the tree. Put a reminder in your phone that in about a year from now is to come back and analyze that tree. If it looks good enough on its own, go ahead and take it off.
Just to clarify here that I'm not recommending this. I'm just using this as an example of what I see quite often in lots of different landscape situations. Esplanades in neighborhoods, HOA managed green spaces and communities, businesses along the highway, etc., where this staking and anchoring has not been removed, and that the outcome here is that this tree is going to be a pretty short-lived tree. This bald cypress here, at the girth that it is at the base, should be a 40 foot 40 foot tree, but right above this it tapers off into a very kind of bonsai looking tree because it's not being able to translocate any water, nutrients and sugars back and forth as necessary. Stephen, do we have any questions here?
No, sir. No questions. We've had questions. We've been managing them, but nothing related to the current presentation.
Okay, fantastic.
I would like to also request, there are a few folks that do have their camera on, Mary Ellen Twiss and Rosalie Bugs. If you could please turn your video camera off, it would help us with the video presentations that we currently have engaged. Thank you very much.
Howdy. I'm out here with this beautiful nature's Crape Myrtle to go over the last thing in this presentation. And this is post-planting maintenance of your young tree. Things that we really need to be thinking about that's crucial to the long-term health and vigor of your tree. The first one is watering. Watering is very important. Young trees need water, but more importantly than that, they don't need too much water. And as a horticulturist in the county, I'll say the number one issue that I see with people having problems with trees is overwatering. We want to water these trees infrequently, but we also want to water them thoroughly. Now what that means is that we want to soak the root zone all the way through that whole area with moisture. And then we want to cut the water off to allow that root zone to dry out. And what this does is allows oxygen down to that rooting zone to encourage those new roots to develop. If that root zone is always wet, we're going to have root rot issues, and we're not going to have the rooting that we hope to get the top part of that tree really getting up and getting going. So if you have an irrigation system in place, make sure that you're not watering every day, every other day, because that root zone's never going to dry out. Also, you want to cross-combine the moisture from your irrigation system with natural rainfall. If it's raining outside, turn the irrigation system off. The tree is getting what it needs naturally. The next thing we want to be thinking about is IPM, and this is called Integrated Pest Management. And the first step of IPM is scouting, and that's important. We want to look for issues with the tree naturally. Even though we may have done our best to secure a good, healthy tree, and we've done everything correctly along the way, that does not mean that Mother Nature might not try to sneak in and side punch us in the process. By going out weekly or every other week and just looking at the tree, look at the leaves, look at the young twigs, the trunk, and see any signs of small populations of soft-bodied insects or disease symptoms. Because these things, even though when they're young, it may not be a problem. They can flare up very quick if we don't notice them on time. And then it will become an issue. It's going to be harder for us to deal with down the road. The next thing I want to talk about is fertilization. When we plant these trees, these young trees, we want to dig the hole out and backfill the native soil back into that hole. Don't put fertilizer down in there. Don't put potting mix or compost or whatever. Just backfill that hole with the native soil. Because that tree needs to know what it's growing into, and it needs a soft area for those new root hairs to come out of the root system and get established into the native soil. Once we see some growth, 6 months down the road, the tree looks like it's putting on new growth and vigorous, you can go ahead and fertilize that tree with a complete fertilizer. Probably not a bad idea to add a little bit of compost outside of the rooting zone to increase the organic matter and the ability for those roots to start going out there scavenging for nutrients in the soil. But right off the bat, we don't want to apply fertilizers to the tree to damage those young sensitive root hairs as they're developing. Ultimately, this is what we want right here, and we've got this done by pruning. Proper pruning early on is very important for the health of the tree as it matures. We make those decisions early on so we don't have to make big pruning decisions later down the road. I won't get into the whole concept of Crape Myrtle today, but when we planted these trees here, these were pruned properly early on so that we don't really have to do anything here to the trees. Occasionally there's a couple of root sprouts that come off the side. We have to remove those and a little bit of light canopy work in here, and that's it. And we can accomplish that by doing young pruning on the tree and doing some good shaping. Other one to think about is that if you have a tree with two competing top canopies in a tight Y format, cut one of those off early on. And that's going to avoid some problems down the road if we get a high wind or a heavy rain event where those two branches want to split off and go in different directions. Make those decisions early on and look for those branches that are going to come off at these far angles, not these tight little narrow angles here, because these are bound to cause you problems down the road. So these post-planting practices are very important because it helps us get here where we want. We have a beautiful specimen that's providing some great shade here at the office, and we got here by following those appropriate practices.
I had about every dump truck managed by Fort Bend County that wanted to come see me recording this video. So I apologize for the background noise there. I just want to showcase this beautiful Crape Myrtle here. It's a really nice specimen. Any questions, Stephen?
There is a question about a couple of pine trees that are thinning on the top. A few snapped off in a storm. The question is, how long do pine trees live? And I get that's a pretty general question, and it depends on the species of pine, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, unfortunately, I love pine trees, but unfortunately, pines as gymnosperms, they don't have the ability to resprout new shoots along the trunk or along the branches. The growth is going to be with these growth meristems at the end, the growing tips, either at the top or at the end of the branches, continually growing outwards. Rarely do you ever see a pine tree that creates a new foliage sprout inside the canopy at the branch junctures or down on the trunk somewhere. So unfortunately, if you lose a significant part of the canopy or branching in a pine tree, it's either going to take a number of years for it to reestablish its shape. If it's gotten to the point where what you might call diminishing returns, you might just make the decision to go ahead and retry that, planting another tree close by there, and then just have a race to see which one is going to end up being the one that grows better for you. The loblolly pine for us, there's limiting conditions with pines in our region. They usually have to do with topography and soil type. If you see pines in the forest, they're highland trees that grow in sand and sandy loam type soils. They're not bottomland trees, and unfortunately, most of our region here is the flat bottomland black clay, which is not the soil or the amount of drainage that those trees would prefer. So if you've got a spot that's raised, if you're on a higher topography landscape, pines may work well for you. But if your soil's flat and your neighborhood topography is typically flat and has poor drainage, you may look at another species. I'm going to try to move away from this presentation for a second to share. I'm going to go into these resources just briefly if I can, Stephen. Do I have enough time?
Yes, sir. We're at top of the hour, 11 o'clock.
Okay, I'll go through them real briefly so that we can see what they look like individually. The Texas A&M Forest Service website, the International Society of Arboriculture homeowner website called treesaregood.org, our local Houston Area Urban Forestry Council, Texas Nursery and Landscape Association, their Best of Texas Landscape Guide, and then our Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, Earthkind Landscaping Plant Selector Tool. Let me see if I can move away from that and go into here. Okay, so the first one, real quick, if we just go to, or just Google search Texas A&M Forest Service, it'll take you to their homepage. And if you just come in here where it says Community and Urban Forestry, these will be the resources right in here that homeowners are going to find very useful. And there's some fantastic stuff in here that goes from everything we've talked about today on taking care of trees, choosing trees, and caring for trees. Similar to that, if I go over here, if I just type in trees are good in my search engine, it should take me here to the ISA homepage. And similar to that, there's this right here where it says tree owner information, and it has lots of information there as far as what to plant, where to plant it, things to think about as far as utilities, drainage, etc., on things to do and maybe not to do in planting a tree. Similar to that here, the Houston Area Urban Forestry Council is a fantastic group of professionals in the arboriculture or forestry industry. And similar to that here, we've got some resources here on planting trees, tree ordinances, caring for trees, etc. Great stuff. It's all here, and that's open for your use and benefit 24/7. I'll go over here to the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association, Best of Texas. They have a printed version of this Best of Texas that you can order from TNLA. It's a great manual of landscape plants that are useful across the state. It's a good coffee table piece, honestly, that will help you give ideas, not just on trees, but all common landscape plants. And so you can search a version of that here online that will kind of guide you through some of those decisions as well. More extensive than that could be found here on our Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Earthkind Landscaping page. Lots of resources here on Earthkind Landscaping, but I would recommend, if you haven't used it, is to click here for the Earthkind Plant Selector, and then within that, it'll guide you to trees, whether you can choose in evergreen trees or deciduous trees, to start giving you some ideas of what trees we may be wanting to put into our landscape. Some things to think about there, obviously, are areas in the landscape to avoid. If we've got underground power lines or utility, phone, internet, cables, etc., is to contact the utility companies appropriately to make sure that we have those lines identified before you start the digging process. But also look up at your power lines. We work with CenterPoint Energy on some programs here in Fort Bend County, where they they want to recommend the right tree in the right place, and particularly for them is outside of the area of power lines where they're going to have to come in at some point and end up being the bad guy that tops your tree off because we planted them on or too close to existing power lines and infrastructure that may cause issues down the road for power outages, etc. So lots of stuff to think about, but ultimately, there's several sayings with trees, and the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, um, and um, and just the fact that there's so many benefits to trees, more than we could probably understand ourselves. So we definitely recommend it. I've got my email address here on this slide, jb.holladay@ag.temu.edu. If you've got any questions down the line, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'd be glad to chat with you about this. But beyond that, Stephen, do we have any closing questions?
No, sir. No closing questions.
Okay, well, I'll let you take it from here. Thank you for attending today. And Stephen, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Mr. Holladay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. This concludes the program for today. This program has been brought to you by the Southeast region of Aggie Horticulture. Horticulturists up and down the coast bringing you Gardening on the Gulf Coast series. We have this series every Wednesday at 10 a.m. The next program will be next week, July the 15th at 10 a.m. Cacti and Succulent Varieties with Kevin Gibbs from the Aggie Extension Horticulturist in Nueces County. July the 22nd, yours truly with Fabulous Figs. I'm in Brazoria County. And then rounding it out, July the 29th, Earthkind Pest Disease and Weed Control with Skip Richter from Brazos County, Horticulturist with Brazos County. You will be emailed a brief survey if you could please participate. We're always looking forward to improving the program that we're offering and seeing how best we can serve your gardening needs. Thank you for joining us. This concludes the recording and the presentation for today.